I welcome you. If you love exciting stories from the past, drama, strong characters, and eternal love against the backdrop of a dangerous frontier, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the most interesting. Today I will tell you a story that is not easy to forget, a story where love has become a crime and the truth is too dangerous to say out loud. It will be a story about the forbidden connection between two worlds, the proud Indian people and the harsh settlers of America during the Wild West. Here, where fate was forged with a revolver and justice was often just a word in the wind, a love that had no right to exist was born. It will be a story about a woman who was considered a stranger among her own people, and about a man whose name was whispered in the steppes, about the chase, betrayal, blood, and sunset, illuminating two lovers doomed to fight against the whole world. We will be transported to a place where the dust rises from the hooves, where every step may be the last, and the laws are written in blood, where the enmity lasted for generations and one wrong feeling could turn into a tragedy, where two souls found each other in the very heart of hatred, in the very center of the storm. Their meeting changed everything, but did it bring hope or just new wounds? Are you ready to hear this story to the end? Then make yourself comfortable. We're getting started. After the introduction, which plunged us into the atmosphere of forbidden love and bloody justice, it's time to get to know those whose story has become the heart of this whole story. Elizabeth was born on American soil, where borders changed faster than the seasons. Her father ran a shop on the edge of the frontier, selling tools, flour, and textiles to those who ventured closer to the wastelands. Elizabeth's mother died when she was still a child, and since then she has learned to handle everything on her own, carrying water, repairing the roof, handling horses. Her face wasn't the kind that decorated posters, but there was something in her eyes that you couldn't buy, calm determination and unspent tenderness. Taka was a leader not by blood, but by spirit. He didn't shout or demand. He watched for a long time, attentively, and remained silent while the others talked. His tribe lived among the pines and tall stones, away from the roads and trade caravans. The elders respected him, and the young men listened to him. There was a strange mixture of primal silence and innate nobility in him. He knew how to wait, and he knew how to let go. When the warriors of the tribe returned from hunting, he did not go first to the prey. He looked at who was tired and brought water. His name was pronounced with reverence. Their worlds were separated by kilometers, but even more so by fear. Both sides believed that trusting meant putting yourself at risk. For the white settlers, the Indians were a threat, a savagery that must either be conquered or circumvented. For the tribe, people from farms and guns were carriers of disease, lies, and grief. And yet sometimes, in the evenings, when the heat subsided and the wind blew the dust away, our eyes crossed. At first, by accident. Then, persistently. Elizabeth first saw Taka when he and his party crossed the stream at the foot of the hill, not far from her house. She was standing with a bucket, and their eyes met, fleetingly, warily. He didn't smile, and so did she, but there was something in that look. Not a threat, no, more like a question. And the silence that hung between them wasn't frightening, it was full of meaning. Since then, their paths have crossed more often. Sometimes she went to get water and saw hoofprints, not the ones left by farm horses. Sometimes, out of the corner of his eye, he caught her silhouette moving between the pines. But so far, no one has dared to come closer. There was a long, bloody, and unforgivable history between them. And yet, no matter how hard they tried to stay in their worlds, something drew them to each other. Not rapidly, not violently, but inevitably. Like the wind that slowly thickens the sky before the rain. Like the light that shines through the cracks of an abandoned barn. Taka knew more about Elizabeth's family than she could have imagined. The tribe has been watching the settlers at the eastern hill for a long time. They saw Elizabeth mending a fence alone, driving a young stallion into a barn, lifting a fallen roof without anyone's help. In his people, such women would be called the daughter of the earth, hardy but fragile in her silence. He saw her as something more than just an outsider, but every time I wanted to get closer, I felt the whisper of bygone generations behind my back. Elizabeth also began to notice that she was waiting. She waits for him to appear again, a tall silhouette against the background of the fire, a light movement of a feather in her hair, a calm step without fear. Unwittingly, she thought about him more and more often. Why is his gaze not like the gaze of other Indians who look down from the hills, checking the land? Why is there no hostility in his face, but only a tired calm? One day she stayed by the river longer than usual. The sun was already sinking, and the sky had become thick with smoky shades of ochre and ash. She was standing up to her ankles in the water, and suddenly she saw him again. This time, he didn't turn away. He took a few steps closer without saying a word. They were separated by several meters, and yet the silence between them was so intense that it seemed as if the wind had stopped. He inclined his head slightly, a sign that held both greetings and respect. Elizabeth nodded back, not knowing why her breathing had stopped. Neither of them took the next step, but there were already more than 100 words in that silence. Their worlds remained as different as day and night. Her father looked suspiciously towards the forest, scolding the authorities for the fact that the wild still lived nearby. His elders said that whites always bring death and iron, but what should the heart do if it stops obeying the mind? The internal conflict grew every day. There was a struggle between duty and what they felt. Among the Takaha people, it was considered treason to even think of an alliance with a white woman. And for Elizabeth, being with an Indian meant being rejected by everyone. And yet, a strange, vague feeling grew stronger inside, which did not disappear. It wasn't called words, it was in the silence, in the gestures, in the way they both slowed down when they felt each other's presence. That's how their invisible thread began. So far, it's thin, almost imperceptible, but day by day it became stronger. They haven't touched each other yet. Not a single word has been spoken yet, but the hearts were already moving towards them, and ahead of them were elections that could not be dismissed, because love in such places is not a gift, but a test. After those quiet glances, after intense expectation and timid steps towards them, a new, heavy knot began to be woven into their story, the name of which was Jonathan Marsh. His estate stood to the south of the Elizabeth family's possessions, spread over lands that had previously belonged to an Indian tribe. Jonathan didn't just own the land, he owned the lives. People in the village bowed their heads as he passed by. The sheriff is his old friend, the judge is his cousin, the bankers are his debtors. He was tall, well-groomed, with a well-groomed face and the look of a man accustomed to receiving everything without unnecessary words. He had been eyeing Elizabeth for a long time, not because of love, but because there was no place for it in his chest. His interest was cold, calculating. Her house stood at the intersection of 3 trails. One path led to the water, the second to the pass, and the third to the Indian lands. Whoever controlled this site controlled more than just the acres. But there was another value in it, an unconquered woman on the edge of civilization. Her independence irritated and excited him at the same time. Jonathan was sure that sooner or later she would get tired. She'll want protection, a man's hand, and he will be there, not as a salvation, but as the only possible choice. His first steps were polite. He sent her offerings, a barrel of molasses, a new axe, a silk handkerchief. Elizabeth returned everything without even opening the packaging. He held back his irritation. For now. When he heard rumors that the woman was looking at the woods too often, Jonathan changed. His face wasn't smiling anymore. He began to act. He ordered his men to set up surveillance on her. He bribed one farmer to accidentally ruin Elizabeth's fence. He began visiting her uninvited, not to talk, but to make it clear that he was there, he was watching, and he was the only one who could decide her fate. But what infuriated him the most was the thought that she might belong to someone else, and not just to another savage. There was something dark and ugly growing inside Jonathan, which he had long ago learned to hide under a polite tone and immaculate suit. For him, it wasn't just a humiliation, it was a challenge. He began to gather allies. He started talking in the saloon, saying that the Indians were getting closer to our homes. They say we should do something before it's too late. He was playing on fears, adding fuel to the fire, and every time his words found ears. And all this time he kept coming to Elizabeth. It was as if nothing had happened, polite as a gentleman, reserved as a Sunday school teacher. But his eyes no longer hid the truth. They were already filled with anger, jealousy, and expectation. He knew that if it didn't work out with affection, he would take it by force. If not a woman, then her land. If not the heart, then freedom. This shadow fell between Elizabeth and her timid feelings for Takahu, because love in those parts did not grow from scratch. She had to go through fear, greed, and anger, and clouds were already gathering ahead. At first, there were only glances, furtive, restrained, as if by accident. Then, minutes. Then there were meetings, short, careful ones, where the silence was louder than words. Elizabeth and Taka began to look for each other in every shadow, in every gust of wind that brought the scent of sage or dust. They knew that their union was impossible. But has true love ever been subject to the laws of the possible? At first, she thought it was just a weakness, a fleeting feeling, against the background of loneliness and longing. But every day, when her hands touched his fingers, when her eyes caught the strength and pain in his gaze, Elizabeth realized, this is not weakness, that's her truth, and there is always danger in the truth. Taka was not just a man, he was a leader. He has history, blood, land, and people behind him. He had no right to be weak, but with her he wasn't weak. He was human. He listened to her heart, her fears, her doubts, and did not try to overcome them. He accepted them, and that was more important to her than all the protection and glory. They met in the misty valleys in the morning, under the sound of pines, in the silence of the night, among the rustling of animals and the wind. He told her about the sky. She told him about music. He showed her how an herb can heal a wound, and she showed her how a book can heal the soul. They opened their worlds to each other, different but not hostile. But no world likes to have its borders erased. Jonathan, the rancher and Elizabeth's ex-fiancé, noticed her coldness. He knew this woman, too free to be obedient, too honest to lie. He didn't ask. He was watching. And when he found out who was occupying her thoughts, his anger did not flare up. It began to smolder. Dangerous. Quietly. Cruelly. He began to spin his web. First, the rumors. Then the money. He bribed the voice, paid for silence, for lies. He said he saw the Indians carrying off the cattle, as if Taka was gathering warriors to attack. He insisted that Elizabeth was not who she claimed to be, that she was a spy, the savage's mistress, traitress. At first, people didn't believe it, but the word, like a seed, falls into the crack of distrust and sprouts. Rumors spread through the village, a whisper in the church, by whispering in the market. She could feel it. The women no longer nodded at her. The men looked at her suspiciously. Even the children stopped waving at her as before. And yet she continued to date Taka, because she knew that what was between them was worth more than fear. It wasn't just attraction, it was togetherness. It was as if their souls had been searching for each other for a long time and had finally found each other. He was her silence, her balance. He believed in her in a way that no one else had before. But Jonathan didn't stop. He hired people to set traps on the border of the tribal land, provoke quarrels, and throw accusations. He was expecting a mistake, and when one of the young men from the tribe happened to be next to the body of the murdered settler, Jonathan struck. He called a meeting. He shouted for justice, for the protection of the settlement, that the savages have started hunting again. Taka turned out to be the accused. Elizabeth is a traitor. She was called a witch, seduced by paganism. She was shunned, she was stigmatized, she was exiled in silence, not by words, but by deeds. She was not given a letter at the post office. Grain was not accepted at the mill. An old pharmacist, a friend of her father's, closed the door in front of her. She was trying to talk, to explain. But fear makes people deaf. Every day the ring around her tightened. Taka realized that everything was changing. Even the elders began to doubt his words. They were afraid that his feelings were leading the tribe to ruin, that his love had blinded him. But he knew Elizabeth wasn't the enemy. She is the reason why he wants peace, not war. She is a bridge, not a weapon. But to prove it, he had to go against everything, against his own people, against strangers, against fate itself. When he came to the ravine at night, where they usually met, and did not find her, he felt an emptiness in his chest. She didn't come, for the first time. He stood in silence for a long time, feeling the wind chill his hands. She wouldn't have left, for a reason. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was sitting in a locked barn, her hands tied, her mouth taped shut. Jonathan couldn't let her destroy his power. Her love is a threat, and threats need to be eliminated. And yet she knew he would come. Taka will find her, not because she's weak, but because they are strong, they are together. The sky above the settlement was covered with heavy clouds of anxiety, as if reflecting the gloomy mood of its inhabitants. The narrow streets, which had been bustling until recently, were now filled with whispers and sidelong glances. There was a smell of distrust in the air, which was getting thicker by the hour, like an impending storm. Elizabeth was caught in the middle of this whirlwind of suspicion. She, a strong and independent woman who had long ago crossed the boundaries of her community, has now become an outcast. Her secret meetings with Taka turned into an excuse for accusations and cruel gossip. Like a traitor, she was accused of undermining the foundations of the settlers, of betraying her family and friends. Elizabeth's heart was pounding in her chest, filled with fear, but at the same time an unshakable determination was born. An internal conflict tore her apart, the love she couldn't deny versus the hatred and fear that assaulted her from all sides. Every glance, every whisper, was a reminder of the coming storm, and a quiet but indomitable hope for justice grew in Elizabeth's soul. There came a moment when hands, cold and ruthless, closed around Elizabeth's wrists. The chains snapped around her arms with a crunch, a symbol of her imprisonment and the accusation that hung over her like an unconquered weight. The woman's gaze, despite the imprisonment, did not lose its inner fire. She knew that even in chains one could not break one's soul without surrendering to fear. A crowd of settlers gathered around, and their faces reflected a mixture of contempt, anger, and anxiety. The stares were sharp, like pointed needles, accusing Elizabeth of betrayal. Their words and actions were fueled by lies that Jonathan spread with cold cunning. He invented stories, exaggerating threats and betrayals, artfully setting people up against a woman who simply loved and was loved. The cruelty and prejudice of the villagers were palpable, in every rustle, in every glance. Their hearts seemed to have closed to understanding and compassion, replaced by fanaticism and fear of change. Elizabeth felt the world around her crumble under the weight of the condemnation, but her inner voice remained firm. She was stronger than the stigma placed on her. In this dark haze of injustice, a spark of an unconquered spirit ignited in the woman's soul, which promised to fight no matter what. Taka stood on a hill, bathed in the dim light of the setting sun, and his eyes looked into the distance, at the settlement where Elizabeth was unjustly kept in chains. The determination burned inside the leader, not to let the darkness of betrayal consume the light of love and justice. He knew that the upcoming campaign was not just a risk to save one woman, it was a struggle for the honor of their tribe and the possibility of a new world. Warriors gathered under his command, strong, silent people, each of whom carried the burden of history and responsibility. There was both anxiety and a willingness to go all the way in their gazes. They deftly prepared weapons, pulled bowstrings, checked cartridges, whispering words of support to each other. At that moment, their hearts beat in unison with the leader. For the sake of love, for the sake of justice, for the sake of a life that could not just be given away. The silence before the storm was palpable, and everyone knew that there was danger ahead that could cost them everything. But no one hesitated. This campaign is a symbol of protest against prejudice, hatred, and cruelty, a symbol of hope that the truth will prevail, and love, like an ancient fire, will burn no matter what. Jonathan is a man with a cold gaze and ambitions that have long gone beyond the simple life of a settler. His envy of Taka and Elizabeth stemmed from his fear of losing control of the territory and the power he had gained among the settlers. He could not accept the idea that love between representatives of two worlds could destroy a fragile order based on prejudice and fear. That is why Jonathan wove his intrigues using lies and bribery. He quietly approached the most vulnerable in the community, bribing them with gold and promises of well-being. His words poured out like poison, making the settlers doubt and turn against the tribe and against Elizabeth. His influence grew like a shadow, ready to devour everything in its path. The ambush was carefully planned. It was supposed to take place in a narrow mountain path at dawn, where a narrow passage left no chance of retreat. Jonathan gathered an armed group of stern men, with cold faces and malicious intent. They hid behind rocks and bushes, preparing to strike at the most unexpected moment. In the pre-dawn fog, the air was saturated with tension and fear. Hearts were pounding fast, and fingers were clutching the hilts of weapons. Everyone knew that this would be a decisive battle, a clash not just between two groups of people, but a clash of ideas, destinies, and love that challenged the world around them. A sharp explosion ripped through the night, echoing down the valley slopes. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, mixed with dust and the bitterness of the impending battle. Taka, gathering his warriors, moved towards where Elizabeth was being held, overcoming every obstacle with determination and silent strength. The leader's heart was beating fast, but his gaze remained calm and focused. He knew that there was more at stake than just the life of one woman. The sounds of gunfire and screams filled the night, causing shadows to flicker across the rocks and trees. The warriors moved quickly, hiding behind boulders, penetrating into the depths of the enemy camp. Every step was filled with danger, but there was no thought of retreating. Love and duty merged into a single feeling, leading them through the chaos. When they finally reached the place of detention, the narrow walls and iron bars seemed like an insurmountable barrier. But Taka did not back down. He broke the lock and freed Elizabeth, whose eyes met his full of tears and hope. At that moment, time stood still. Fear and pain were replaced by relief and an unbroken spirit. But the danger did not recede. The enemy was advancing, and Taka, taking the risk, covered Elizabeth with his body, ready to fight until his last breath. In this dark battle, a bright spark of love broke out, lighting the way through the storm of hatred and injustice. In the midst of chaos and battles, when the world around them was collapsing from fire and pain, a quiet but inextinguishable light flashed between them. Elizabeth and Taka's gaze met. They reflected not only love, but also deep mutual understanding and support. Their touch was like a quiet promise. No matter what, they were together. Through the smoke and darkness, as if through the thickest forest, love shone for them as a beacon of hope. It became more than just a personal feeling. It was a force capable of resisting storms and hatred, a symbol of a future in which reconciliation and peace were possible. The inner light emanating from their unity cut through the darkness, filling their hearts with determination and faith. This love became their shield and sword, their salvation and guiding star in the endless desert of trials and struggles. Night had fallen, shrouding the earth in a velvety darkness, with only dim stars breaking through the thick sky. Only footsteps and muffled breathing could be heard in the silence as Elizabeth and Taka cautiously left the deserted place where gunfire and screams had recently been heard. The wind rustled the dry grass as if suggesting a way to freedom. Their hands were tightly clasped, their hearts were beating in unison, and there was an unshakable strength in this silent union. Together they stand against the whole world, against injustice and betrayal, ready to go through any ordeal. They faced the unknown, but not fear. but the hope that their story was just beginning, a story that would change their destinies and perhaps the destinies of those who still believe in love and peace. With each passing day, the settlement no longer breathed fear as before. It listened warily to its own conscience. Outside the cozy homes, among the pastures and dusty paths, the spirit of awakening was spreading. There were still old signs on the walls of the church about the purity of the community, but their meaning was becoming more and more questionable. The voice of a woman named Agatha, the widow of a local teacher, was especially strong, elderly, and inconspicuous, but with a firm heart. It was she who addressed the congregation on the day of the Sunday sermon. Right on the steps of the church, she raised her head and spoke not to the priest, but to the people, about how she had seen Elizabeth since childhood, feeding the sick, caring for the dying, saving children from hunger in difficult years. She didn't speak loudly, but every word hit the audience's chest. Then a farmer stood up, whom the Takaha tribe had once warned about an alien raid. He remembered how one of the soldiers brought a sack of grain to his house when the drought destroyed the harvest. He kept quiet about it for years, afraid of being ostracized, but now it's time to speak up. The details, the mosaic, were interlocked into a single picture. What had seemed like forbidden knowledge before was now becoming obvious. Taka was not an enemy, but a savior. Elizabeth is not a traitor, but a woman in love with a man, not a symbol of fear. Letters, hidden documents, and the pharmacist's notes all surfaced, as if time itself had decided to side with justice. Even among those who had previously supported Jonathan, there were doubters. Some left his entourage, others simply stopped trusting him. And finally, the most unexpected ally came, the priest, who was once restrained and indifferent. He came out to the people in the evening silence and confessed that he knew about Elizabeth's meetings with the Indian. He knew but did not condemn because he saw in her not sin, but purity and truth. He talked about love as a gift, not a crime. After that, Jonathan had nowhere to hide. His accusations began to sound like the screams of a man who had lost control. Rumors of his bribes, extortion, and secret dealings have become facts. One by one, his former supporters began to recant, and when one of his men publicly confessed to involvement in the attack, it was the last straw. The decision to exile was made not in anger, but in awareness. Jonathan left the settlement under escort, with his head down, surrounded by those who no longer believed in his justice. People didn't shout after them. They didn't throw stones. They no longer needed to take revenge. They simply refused to continue living his lies. But the truth, like a spring after a drought, continued to flow. Elizabeth and Taka, wherever they were at that moment, were no longer just exiles, no longer just lovers. They became symbols of change. And it didn't matter who they were by blood, it was important who they became to everyone else. The Takaha tribe and the settlers finally began to look at each other not as strangers, but as people whose pain and hope are similar. The first meeting of the elders of both sides took place without weapons, without threats, for the first time in many years. And that was the beginning of a new world. And in this new land, which had not yet been written to the end, the main thing remained, a place for love, real, strong, long-suffering, but alive, the one that could only grow on the debris of fear. The dust has not yet settled after those anxious nights when the earth groaned under the hooves and the hearts beat with alarm at every rustle. The world seemed to freeze, waiting for the denouement. No one spoke out loud, but the tension in the village was like before a thunderstorm. People looked at each other warily, as if they had forgotten how to trust each other. Everything changed after the truth began to break through the lies. At first it was just whispers. Someone heard Jonathan talking to people, promising them land for their silence. Someone noticed how strange guests appeared in his house with downcast eyes and heavy bags. But now it was all coming out, step by step, like water seeping through the cracks of a dam. The first to open was Thomas, an old blacksmith, a respected man in the village. He claimed that Jonathan had offered him gold to testify against Elizabeth. Then he was joined by the widow Miller, who confessed that she had heard Jonathan incite the men to an act of retaliation against the Indian camp. The words went on, grew in weight, fell from his lips, and nothing could stop them. The crowd in the square gathered not by order, but by the call of conscience. People came in silence, looking hard at the one they used to believe. Jonathan stood on the steps of the city hall, and his face, once confident, was now grey, like a weathered stone. He tried to speak, to justify himself, to throw accusations in response, but the words broke into silence. He had no allies left. Those he bought turned away. Those who were afraid found strength in themselves, and those who were silent started talking. His lies, which had confused many, now seemed fragile, like a spider's web in the wind, and everyone who had previously doubted Elizabeth and Takaha felt shame in their chest. The decision was not announced. It matured on its own. People just started moving away from him, one by one. No shouting, no threats. It was as if they were passing sentence with their silence. And then Jonathan hunched over and walked away. His steps were heavy, but each step sounded like relief to those who remained. His figure was lost in the dusty road outside the city, among thorns and weeds, as if the earth itself rejected his presence. And no one stopped him. No one extended a hand. His power melted away along with his trust, and now he was just a man, lonely, broken, exiled. That day, for the first time, the village breathed a new sigh. The truth began to break through the cracks of distrust. The sunlight, the same as before, suddenly seemed warmer, and a shadow of hope appeared in the faces of the people. Elizabeth stood aside, not trying to gloat. Her heart felt no triumph, only relief, and deep down she felt that the world was still capable of changing. Taka, standing in the distance, watched the symbol of hatred crumble and remained silent. He knew that the real victory was not in the fall of the enemy, but in the choice of people to believe in the truth. When the dust raised by the storm of betrayal finally settled and the anger began to recede, silence remained on the scorched earth. In that silence, something new began. At first, it was timid, barely noticeable, like a light wind among tall grasses. People who had recently looked at each other through narrowed eyes and suspicion now began to exchange glances that no longer contained hatred. There was tired amazement and hope. Elizabeth wasn't hiding anymore. She stood next to Taka, not looking down. Their hands weren't touching, but there was a connecting thread between them, as if the very ground beneath their feet recognized their right to be together. Taka no longer spoke in speeches. Now his silence carried the weight of tradition and peace. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't crying out for pity. He just was. His people stood behind him, restrained but proud, ready for peace. The settlers, tired of fear, began to understand, not everything, but enough to shake the balance. For the first time in a long time, women approached the Indian women themselves, carrying blankets and bread. The men nodded to each other without words, agreeing on a simple one. You can't go on living like this. One of the elders, who had once been the first to vote for Elizabeth's expulsion, now brought the water himself and apologized without words. Her gaze was steady, but there was no anger in it anymore, only deep adult pain and forgiveness. They started repairing burnt-out houses together. The Indians shared hunting trophies, the settlers shared tools. There was more to the sound of axes and hammers than work. It was a new song, not yet learned by heart, but already familiar to the hearts. The children were the first to erase the boundaries. They didn't care who was on which side. They ran, played, and laughed, confusing languages and rules, and hope seemed to come alive in that laughter. It was the children who were the first to call each other by name, without fear. They were the ones who held out their hands while the adults were still hesitating. Taka and Elizabeth stood in the center of everything. They didn't command. They were just next to each other, like two trees growing side by side from different seeds, but intertwined by their roots. Their love was no longer a secret. Now she has become a symbol. People began to see her not as a threat, but as an opportunity. If they could, maybe everyone else could. When a general meeting was built on the site of the burned warehouse, not a church, not a wigwam, but something new, a white ribbon with an embroidered feather and an old banner with 13 stars were brought there. No one argued whose place was more important. Everything was just there. It wasn't the end. That was the beginning. A step into the unknown, but a step together. When the first rays of the morning sun began to break through the gaps in the treetops, Elizabeth and Tucker stood on a hilltop, looking at the world they had helped to revive together. Their hands were tightly intertwined, as if unwilling to let go of each other. In this gesture was all the strength of their feelings and the promise of the future they were creating. The past trials left traces of fatigue and pain on their faces, but in their eyes burned the fire of hope and endless faith that love is able to overcome any obstacles. Their story, from distrust and fear to mutual acceptance and respect, has become a symbol of a new era where differences have ceased to be the cause of hostility, but have become the basis for friendship and mutual support. The wind gently played with her wavy brown hair, and the feathers in Tucker's headdress rustled softly, like an echo of ancient traditions living in their every breath. Their hearts beat in unison, a wordless promise to be there no matter what. The horizon seemed endless, filled with light and possibilities. It seemed that the earth itself breathed a sigh of relief, and now every new day could be the beginning of something great. For the two of them, for their tribes, for the whole region that survived the storm of hatred and betrayal. And in this radiance, among the wild nature, under the cover of the sky, two worlds intertwined, the old and the new, to give life to a love that could turn the destinies and ignite the light of hope for all who dare to believe. At dawn, when the first rays of the sun painted the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold, two streams of water merged into one wide, mighty river. Just like these rivers, two worlds, the Indian and the settler, merged, overcoming division and disagreement in order to move towards a new future together. Their waters, full of power, depth, and life, became a symbol of rebirth and unity. Elizabeth and Tucker stood on the shore, watching as the rushing river carried not only the waters, but also the dreams, hopes, and promises that now united their communities. The wind gently brushed her long wavy hair, and its feathers gently waved in the morning light. There was no fear in their gazes, only confidence and love, stronger than any wall. This moment, like the beginning of a great journey that has yet to be completed, reminded us that even after the darkest storms, light comes. Their story has become living proof that love can change everything if you fight for it. Together, they were ready to face any challenge, building a new world with enough room for everyone. People gathered on the horizon, Indians and settlers, to celebrate the first joint holiday, where songs, laughter, and hope for a better tomorrow sounded. There, among the dancing and lights, a new era was born, full of peace, mutual respect, and true love. And although the road was still long and the shadows of the past loomed ahead, Elizabeth and Tucker knew that together they were stronger than any obstacles. Their love has become a light leading everyone forward, towards freedom, justice, and peace. The story of Elizabeth and Tucker is not just a story of love that overcame obstacles and dark times. It is a reminder that even in the darkest hours, hope can shine brightest, and the heart can find the strength to love and believe. Thank you for being with us on this journey through the storm and the light. If you like this story, don't forget to like it, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories about courage, love, and change ahead. Your participation inspires us to create more such touching and important stories. See you soon. May your hearts be open to love and light, and may the way forward be filled with hope and faith in the best. Thank you for staying with us.